If I told you we only had 7 days left together, would you love me any differently? Sophie never believed in second chances, until the universe gave her one. One moment, she was living in a world where Ethan was just a painful memory. The next, she was 5 years in the past, staring at the man who had once been her everything. But there's a catch. Time is counting down. She has exactly 7 days before everything resets. This time, will she fight for the love they lost? Or is she destined to lose him all over again? Chapter 1, The Clock Starts Ticking. If I told you we only had 7 days left together, would you love me any differently? Sophie's heart pounded as she stared at Ethan. He was standing in front of her, just like he had 5 years ago. The same brown eyes, the same soft smile. But this wasn't possible. She had lost him. Ethan had walked away. Life had moved on. She had spent years convincing herself that their love was nothing but a memory, a faded photograph in the back of her mind. Yet, here he was, standing in front of her as if nothing had changed. The air between them felt electric, charged with emotions neither of them had spoken aloud. She knew this wasn't real. It couldn't be. But then her gaze fell on his wrist, the old watch she had given him, stuck at 11:59, just before midnight. Just before their time had run out. Ethan frowned. Sophie. You okay? His voice was exactly as she remembered, warm, familiar, like home. Her breath hitched. Ethan, how are you here? He chuckled, confused. What do you mean? We were just talking last night. Last night? Sophie's mind spun. The last time she had seen him, really seen him, was 5 years ago, on the night he left. But now, the world around her looked different, as if she had stepped back into the past. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling. The screen lit up. The date was wrong. It was 5 years ago. The day before everything had fallen apart. Her stomach twisted. Somehow, she had been given another chance. But why? And for how long? Her eyes locked onto the broken watch. The second hand ticked once, then stopped. And suddenly, she knew. Time was counting down. She only had 7 days before everything reset. Before she lost Ethan all over again. Chapter 2, Love in a Time Loop. The next morning, Sophie woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She had spent the entire night staring at the clock, watching the minutes slip away, terrified that midnight would steal this reality from her. But when the sun rose, Ethan was still there. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she hesitated before glancing at him. He was standing by the window, sipping his coffee like he always used to. She swallowed hard. This was exactly how things had been 5 years ago. Morning, sunshine, he said, flashing that familiar half-smile. A lump formed in her throat. She knew what was coming next. In a few hours, they would go out for lunch. At exactly 3:47 p.m., they would argue about something small, something insignificant. And that argument would plant the first seed of distance between them. The beginning of the end. But what if she could change it? A thought struck her. If she was truly reliving this week, then she had a chance to rewrite it. To make it right. She forced a smile. Morning. Ethan studied her for a second, as if sensing something was different about her. You okay? No. She wasn't. But this time, she was determined to make things different. She had 7 days to fix what went wrong. And this time, she wasn't going to waste a single second. Chapter 3, Unraveling the Mystery. Sophie spent the entire morning replaying the past in her mind. She had lived this before, but now, she was caught in the strange space between memory and reality. She knew what should happen next, but what if she changed it? At 3:47 p.m., she and Ethan would have their first fight, the one that started everything. It wasn't even a big fight. Just a disagreement about something small, a missed call, a delayed text, a moment of silence that lasted too long. But it planted a seed of doubt, one that slowly grew into the cracks that tore them apart. Not this time. She checked the time. 3:30 p.m. The cafe was exactly how she remembered, sunlight spilling through the large glass windows, the scent of roasted coffee beans filling the air. Ethan was sitting across from her, laughing at something on his phone. Completely unaware that history was waiting to repeat itself. This was the moment. She took a deep breath, knowing what was coming. Any second now, his phone would buzz with a message from an unknown number. A coworker? A friend? She had never found out. She only knew that it had made her stomach drop back then. And she had let it ruin everything. The phone buzzed. Ethan glanced at it, then flipped it over, face down on the table. Sophie's heart raced. This was it. The moment that changed everything. She looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't hiding anything. He never had been. But back then, she had let doubt creep in, let fear speak louder than the love she felt for him. So this time, she smiled. Let it go. Ethan noticed. What? She shook her head. Nothing. His eyes softened. You sure? She reached across the table, lacing her fingers through his. Yeah. I love you. Ethan blinked, caught off guard. Then, slowly, he smiled. I love you too, sophomore. The phone, the argument that was supposed to happen, never did. For the first time, the timeline had changed. But Sophie had no idea that changing one thing meant changing everything. Chapter 4, Falling in Love Again. That night, Sophie lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest. She had changed something. Back then, she had let doubt win. That tiny seed of insecurity had grown into distance, then silence, and finally, heartbreak. But this time, she had stopped it before it began. And Ethan? He felt different too. He had looked at her the way he used to, before life had pulled them apart. As if she was his entire world. Maybe she really did have a chance to rewrite everything. The thought sent a thrill down her spine. The next morning, Ethan surprised her with breakfast. Pancakes with too much syrup, just the way she liked. Sophie laughed. What's this? He grinned, flipping another pancake onto a plate. You seemed happy yesterday. I figured I'd keep that streak going. Her heart clenched. He noticed. She sat down, watching him move around the kitchen. The way his hair was slightly messy, the way he hummed an off-key song under his breath. It hit her all at once. She was falling in love with him again. Not just because of the past. Not because of the memories. But because of who he was right now. And suddenly, it terrified her. Because she had no idea how much time she really had. At some point, the week would end. What would happen then? Would she wake up back in the future? Would she lose him all over again? She pushed the thought away. Not yet. For now, Ethan was still here. And for the first time in a long time, she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could keep him. But time had other plans. Chapter 5, The Truth About the Loop. Sophie knew something was wrong the moment she woke up. The air in the room felt different. Too still. Too quiet. She turned over in bed, expecting to see Ethan still sleeping beside her. But the space was empty. Cold. Her stomach twisted. Then she heard it. The faint sound of muffled voices coming from outside. Sophie rushed to the window and saw Ethan standing near his car, talking to someone. A woman. She squinted. No. It couldn't be. The woman was her. Or at least, the version of her that belonged to this time. The past Sophie. Sophie stumbled back, gripping the windowsill. What the hell was happening? Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of it. If she was here, then where was the real past version of her supposed to be? Had she replaced herself? Or were there two of her in this timeline? And if there were, what happened when they finally crossed paths? She had been so focused on fixing the past, so lost in the idea of rewriting history, that she hadn't considered the real consequences of being here. The reality hit her like a wave. This wasn't just a second chance. This was a countdown. Something, or someone, had given her these 7 days. But if she was meant to change things, why was the past version of her still here? Unless this was never about fixing anything. This was about accepting what was already written. Sophie's breath came fast and shallow. She had less than 3 days left before the week ended. And now, she wasn't sure if she had been given a gift. Or a warning. Chapter 6, Running Out of Time. Sophie couldn't breathe. She had spent the past few days believing she could change everything, rewrite the heartbreak, undo the pain. But now, staring at herself standing next to Ethan, she realized. Maybe she was never meant to stay. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the window frame. She had to be careful. If her past self saw her, would it destroy the timeline completely? Or worse, would she just disappear? She needed answers. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and slipped out the back door, circling around the block. She kept her head down, her pulse hammering in her ears. As she got closer, she heard their voices. "Ethan, we need to talk." Her past self sounded tense. Ethan sighed. "I know." Sophie froze. She remembered this conversation. This was the night they almost broke up. The past version of her had been drowning in doubt, overthinking everything. She had been scared of how much she loved Ethan, afraid that something so good couldn't possibly last. And Ethan, he had been patient. But even he had limits. Sophie knew how this ended. She had walked away, leaving him standing there. And after that, nothing had been the same. But now she had a choice. She could let this moment happen the way it always had. Or, she could do something reckless. Something that could change everything. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, out of the shadows. Right into the path of her past self. For a single, breathless second, their eyes met. The world seemed to tilt. A sharp ringing filled Sophie's ears. And then everything went black. Chapter 7, A Fractured Reality. Sophie's eyes snapped open. Her head throbbed, her vision blurred. The world around her was spinning, voices echoing, distant yet familiar. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, as if she were caught between two different realities. And maybe, she was. She struggled to sit up, her pulse hammering in her ears. Where was she? Had she passed out? Was she Sophie? Her heart nearly stopped. She turned her head slowly, and there he was. Ethan. But something was wrong. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read, a mixture of shock, confusion, and fear. Sophie's stomach twisted. Did he know? Had he seen what happened? Then, another voice. Her voice. Sophie's breath caught as she turned, and came face to face with herself. Her past self. She felt like she was looking into a mirror, but the girl standing before her wasn't a reflection. She was real. Alive. Confused. And she was staring back at Sophie as if she were seeing a ghost. What the hell is going on? Past Sophie's voice was sharp, panicked. She turned to Ethan, who looked just as lost. Who is she? Ethan shook his head. I don't, she looks just like you. Past Sophie took a step back. No. Not just like me. She is me. Silence. Sophie felt her body grow cold. She had broken the one rule she hadn't even realized existed: never let your past self see you. This wasn't just a second chance anymore. This was a paradox. The world around her flickered, like a glitch in time, a crack in reality itself. A low humming noise filled the air, something unnatural, something wrong. Then, a sharp pain shot through Sophie's chest. She gasped, clutching at her heart. It felt like something was pulling her, dragging her away, out of this moment, out of this timeline. Ethan's eyes widened. Sophie, what's happening to you? Past Sophie's expression darkened. She understood. She's not supposed to be here, she whispered. Are you? Sophie's breath shuddered. No. She wasn't. She had never been meant to stay. And now, time was trying to fix itself. Chapter 8, Love Against Time. Sophie's body trembled. The pain in her chest grew sharper, spreading like wildfire. She was fading. She could feel it, her presence unraveling, her very existence in this timeline slipping through her fingers. The paradox had finally caught up to her. Ethan reached for her, panic in his eyes. Sophie, talk to me. What's happening? Past Sophie took another step forward, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, realization. You're not supposed to be here, she said softly. That's why this is happening. Sophie swallowed hard. I didn't mean to break anything. And she hadn't. She had only wanted one more chance. A chance to make things right, to rewrite the pain. But love wasn't something you could control. And time had never been hers to change. Ethan's grip tightened on her wrist. Then we stop it. We fix whatever's wrong. You're not going anywhere. His voice was strong, certain, just like before. Sophie shook her head, blinking back tears. Ethan. I don't think you can stop it. But he didn't let go. You don't get to say goodbye. Not like this. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the same desperation she had once felt when she let him walk away. The same moment she had come back to change. Sophie turned to her past self. If I disappear, don't let him go. Her past self's breath caught. Don't let your fear make the choice for you, Sophie whispered. Because I promise you, if you lose him, you will regret it every single day. Past Sophie's eyes shimmered. And in that moment, Sophie knew. The loop had never been about fixing the past. It had been about making peace with it. She smiled through the tears, one last time. Live the life I couldn't. A final pulse of pain surged through her. The world around her blurred, darkened, collapsed in on itself. And then. Silence. Chapter 9, A Life Without Her. Ethan blinked. 1 second, she had been there, holding on to him, speaking to him, fading before his eyes. And then, she was gone. Vanished. As if she had never existed at all. His breath came in ragged gasps. His hands were still outstretched, still reaching for someone who was no longer there. What just? Chapter 10, The Time We Almost Had. Years passed. Ethan still thought about her. Not Sophie, the one standing beside him now, the one who had never let him go. But the other her. The one who had loved him across time. The one who had given up everything for a second chance she would never get to live. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, he wondered if she was still out there, somewhere. Or if she had ever existed at all. But then, he would feel Sophie's hand in his, the warmth of her presence, the life they had built together. And he would remind himself, she had given him this. Their love had been a paradox, a tragedy wrapped inside a miracle. A story that no one would ever believe. A love that had once existed in two timelines, but could only survive in one. As Ethan watched the sunset, Sophie leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "Do you ever think about her?" she asked softly. Ethan didn't lie. "Every day." Sophie squeezed his hand. "Me too." And they sat there, in the golden light of evening, carrying the memory of a love that had once been, and the love that still remained. Because some people stay in our hearts forever, even if they were never meant to stay at all. The end. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the pain, the love, and the bittersweet beauty of the time we almost had, then don't let this moment fade. Some loves are meant to stay, and some are meant to teach us what we can never have. But stories like this, they stay with you forever. So if you want more deep, emotional, and unforgettable stories like this, hit that subscribe button now. Your support keeps these stories alive, and trust me, the next one might just be even more powerful. Subscribe now, and let's create something unforgettable together.